My name is Sarah, and I'm 22 years old. It might seem strange to you that a girl my age lives with her uncle, but life has turned out in such a way that this house has become my temporary refuge. I have always been drawn to art, and I have dedicated myself to graphic design. My days are filled with orders, ideas, sketches, and hours in front of the computer. But if someone had asked me just a couple of months ago if I could imagine myself in this situation, I would have said no. Life is a tricky thing. It pushes us into the most unexpected places, and now I find myself here, in the old but cozy house of my Uncle Owen. After my parents divorced, my mom took a job in another state. It was her chance for career growth but not for stability. Since I was in my final year of college, I needed to stay in the city. Owen, my uncle, turned out to be the only one who offered help. He has lived in this rural part of Wisconsin for a long time with his wife Elaine. They have a beautiful, spacious house with a large plot of land surrounding it, like a picturesque frame for a painting. When I first stepped onto their porch, it seemed to me that this place would be just another stop on my journey. I knew I wouldn't stay here for long. However, even the first days brought surprises. Owen greeted me with kindness. His warm welcome was genuine, immediately filling me with a sense of security. His wife Elaine was friendly, although I couldn't shake the feeling that there was an invisible wall between us. Not hostility, rather caution, as if she didn't know how to relate to me. The house was something out of childhood memories. Large windows letting in soft sunlight, wooden beams smelling of fresh resin, and old but well-maintained rugs on the floor. Every corner seemed steeped in history. Photographs hung on the walls. Owen in his youth, his familiar smile recognizable from afar, and Elaine with her restrained beauty. There was something cozy and yet unspoken about this house, as if every detail hid a secret. Elaine offered me the guest room at the end of a long hallway. It was minimally furnished but with love. A simple bed with a snow-white cover, a small table by the window, and a bookshelf full of novels and reference books. I quickly settled in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something would change. The first weeks passed quietly. I worked, helped Elaine in the kitchen, and in the evenings we all had dinner together in the large dining room. Owen often joked that he now had 2 women in the house, and his laughter was infectious. He was a person you couldn't help but love. Open, honest, and incredibly charismatic. His energy filled the house, and his attention to detail made him incredibly caring. But after some time I began to notice small moments, seemingly trivial things. How he looked at me when he thought I wasn't noticing, or how his voice changed slightly when he spoke to me. I tried to convince myself that it was all my imagination, that he was just a caring person, but these thoughts kept creeping into my mind. One evening after an especially tiring day, I sat on the porch with a cup of hot tea. The air was filled with the scent of autumn, the smell of fallen leaves, slight dampness, and freshness. Owen joined me. His steps were so quiet that I only noticed him when he was already sitting next to me. "You seem thoughtful," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Just reflecting," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He smiled slightly but said nothing more. The silence between us was unexpectedly comfortable, yet tense. I felt his presence next to me, and my heart began to beat faster. It seemed as if time had stopped, that this moment existed outside of everything else. That evening, I went to my room earlier than usual, but sleep did not come. My thoughts were filled with images and feelings that I couldn't explain. Owen is my uncle, I reminded myself again and again, but this did not calm my inner turmoil. Perhaps this moment was the beginning of the changes. Perhaps it was then that I realized something inside me was starting to change, that something was happening between us that I couldn't control. Days blended into a monotonous sequence of work, household chores, and rare moments of rest. Life in Owen's house seemed simple, even cozy, but beneath this surface lay emotions that I couldn't comprehend. Something in our interactions with him had changed, and I felt it with all my being. Elaine was polite and attentive, but her absence from the house became noticeable. She often went away for work or to meet with friends, and the house filled with silence. These moments I spent behind my laptop, completing orders for clients. Sometimes I heard Owen working in the garage or in the yard, and this barely audible sound helped me not feel lonely. But the silence became something more than just the absence of sound. It filled the house, enveloped me, and this feeling was both calming and frightening. One evening, when Elaine was away again, I went downstairs to the living room after a long day of work. Owen was sitting on the couch with a book in his hands, but when I entered he looked up and smiled. "Too late for work, don't you think?" he asked, putting the book aside. "Maybe, but the deadline doesn't wait," I replied, sitting in the chair opposite. "You never rest. That's bad. You're young. You need time for yourself." I smiled, but his words made me think. We started talking about my projects, life in college, and the conversation drifted into more personal topics. I told him about my fears and worries, and he listened with remarkable attention. His gaze was warm but also penetrating. I felt naked before him, not physically but emotionally. From that moment, our conversations became more frequent and deeper. We talked about everything. His youth, my dreams, even trivial things like favorite movies. He was a patient listener, and I realized that I began to look forward to these moments. They became my salvation from the routine. But with each new conversation, I felt an inexplicable anxiety. I tried to convince myself that our relationship remained within the bounds of propriety, but I couldn't ignore the inner voice that insisted it was not so. These moments of closeness, even if platonic, awakened something unfamiliar in me, and I couldn't stop it. One late evening, when the house was already quiet, I went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. The light was already on. Owen stood by the window, holding a glass of wine in his hands. He didn't notice me right away, and I froze in the doorway watching him. His figure was calm, but he seemed tense, as if he was thinking about something. "Can't sleep." His voice sounded unexpectedly, and I flinched slightly. "Just wanted some water," I replied, approaching the sink. He smiled, but there was something in his gaze that I couldn't understand. We were silent for a few minutes while I filled the glass and drank the water. Then he came closer, standing within arm's reach. It was a strange feeling being so close to him. My heart began to beat faster. "Sarah," he said softly, as if unsure whether to continue. "You seem a bit lost lately. Is everything okay?" I didn't know how to answer. This question caught me off guard. Is everything okay? I wasn't even sure myself. But his voice, his presence made me feel safe. Too safe. Just a lot of work. "It's nothing," I lied, trying to hide my true thoughts. He looked at me with an expression that made me look away. His perceptiveness always scared me. It seemed like he saw what I was trying to hide, even from myself. "If you need anything, just say so. You know you can count on me, right?" He said it softly, his voice soothing, but I caught something else in it. "Of course, thank you, Owen," I replied, trying not to look him in the eyes. I returned to my room, but sleep did not come. His words echoed in my head, his voice, his gaze. For the first time in a long time, I felt that the line between what is right and what is permissible was becoming thinner. That night became the point of no return. I knew it deep down, but I kept trying to convince myself otherwise. The next day, everything seemed normal, but inside me, a swarm of thoughts buzzed that I couldn't calm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something between Owen and me had changed. Or was it just my illusions? Elaine, as always, was busy, went to the city for a few days on her business, leaving us alone in the house. I tried to focus on work, but the thought of last night's conversation, of how Owen looked at me, wouldn't let go. By evening, I decided to take a walk in the garden, hoping to distract myself. The setting sun painted the sky in golden pink hues, and the trees cast long shadows on the ground. I walked along the path, breathing in the fresh air, but I couldn't escape my thoughts. Suddenly, I heard his voice. "Sarah, mind some company?" I turned around and saw Owen. He stood a little way off, holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. His smile was soft, almost shy. "Of course," I replied, trying to hide my excitement. We sat on a bench under an old oak tree. He poured us each a glass of wine, and we silently enjoyed the view. In such moments, a special silence reigned between us, which did not seem awkward but was filled with something inexpressible, almost tangible. "You've been thinking a lot lately," he began, finally breaking the silence. "Sometimes it seems to me that you keep too much to yourself." His words caught me off guard. He looked at me attentively but without pressure, as if studying whether I was ready to respond. "I'm just not used to sharing. A habit of living with my own thoughts," I replied evasively, avoiding his gaze. "And sometimes that's right," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But Sarah, I hope you know that I'm always here if you need to talk. You're not alone." These words awoke a strange warmth in me, mixed with anxiety. His voice, his closeness, all of it made me feel on the brink of something inexplicable. I couldn't define what it was, but the feeling pulsed inside, growing stronger. Suddenly, he placed his hand on mine. This movement was so natural that I didn't even realize what had happened right away. His fingers gently squeezed mine, and I felt my breath quicken. "Sarah," he began but fell silent, as if searching for words. I looked up and met his eyes. In them was something I found hard to understand. A combination of tenderness, warmth, and something deeper that I couldn't name. My heart beat faster, and I felt the tension between us growing. "You're important to me," he said softly, and these words, though innocent, sounded deeper than they should have. I didn't know how to respond. My consciousness was filled with contradictions. Part of me wanted to step back, run away, and another part wanted to stay here on this bench next to him. The feeling of his hand on mine was exhilarating. It seemed as if the whole world had shrunk to this moment, to this touch. I didn't say a word, but it seemed he didn't need an answer. He just smiled slightly, removed his hand, and looked back at the horizon as if nothing had happened. But inside me, everything had turned upside down. When I returned to the house, I found it hard to gather my thoughts. His words, his touch, all of it echoed in my head. Lying down to sleep, I felt as if I were standing on the threshold of something huge and inevitable. And I knew I couldn't step back across this threshold. After that walk, I noticed that the rhythm of communication between Owen and me had changed. It seemed we both circled around an invisible line that had already been erased, but we pretended it still existed. Elaine remained in the city, and the house, filled only with our voices, breathed with a strange, almost tangible energy. One late evening, when I was sitting in my room behind my laptop, I heard a knock at the door. It was Owen. "You're not asleep yet?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "No, I'm working," I replied, gesturing for him to come in. He looked into the room, smiling restrainedly. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the chair. "Of course," I said, though my heart was already beating faster. He sat down opposite me, his gaze wandering around the room. "You work a lot, Sarah. You know, sometimes you need to take a break." I nodded but said nothing. His presence filled the entire space. Owen's gaze stopped on my drawings lying on the table. "You're incredibly talented," he said, picking up one of the sketches. "I've never told you this, but I'm proud of you." "Thank you," I whispered, feeling the blood rush to my cheeks. He put the drawing aside, leaning his elbows on the table, and looked straight at me. His gaze was so deep that I felt as if he were reading me, seeing everything I tried to hide. "You seem tense lately," he said, his voice so soft it seemed he was saying it only to himself. "Are you sure everything is okay?" I didn't know how to answer. His words, his closeness blurred all my thoughts. My heart was pounding like a drum, and the air in the room seemed thick. I could only nod. He reached out and, to my surprise, touched my hand. His touch was so light, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to burn me. I froze, afraid to move. "Sarah," he began but fell silent, as if searching for words. "Sometimes it seems to me that we have become closer than we should." These words cut through the air like a knife. I couldn't utter a word, just looked at him, not knowing what I felt. Fear, embarrassment, or something much deeper. "If I said something wrong," he added, removing his hand, "I'm sorry." I took a breath, finally deciding to respond. "No, you didn't say anything. It's just, this is all. Too unexpected." Owen stood up, his movements slow, as if he didn't want to break this moment. Get some rest, Sarah. And remember, I'm always here if you need to talk. He left, leaving me in absolute silence. But this silence was no longer empty. It was filled with thoughts, feelings that I couldn't escape. The next day I tried to act as usual, but inside me, everything was tense. Owen was restrained as if he wanted to give me space, but this only intensified the feeling that something between us had changed. Every glance, every accidental touch filled the air with invisible electricity. By evening, the tension had reached its peak. I was sitting in the living room trying to concentrate on a book when he came in. His gaze slid over me, and I felt a cold sweat run down my spine. "Sarah, can we talk?" he asked, his voice serious. I nodded, though I felt like my heart was about to jump out of my chest. He sat down next to me, closer than usual, and his gaze met mine. "I know this is wrong," he began, and his voice trembled slightly. "But I can't ignore it. There's something between us, and it's something that goes beyond what I can understand." His words echoed in my head. I also felt it. Everything I felt but was afraid to admit had now been said aloud. I looked at him, and for the first time I allowed myself to be honest. "I don't know what this is, but I feel the same way." His eyes widened, and a mixture of relief and anxiety appeared on his face. The air was filled with silence, but it was no longer empty. That night I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. His words kept echoing in my head, each one igniting a fire in my heart that I couldn't extinguish. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The evening was quiet, but in this silence, I felt an approaching storm. Elaine had gone away for a few more days, leaving us alone. The house seemed too big, empty, every corner resonating with my thoughts. I tried to focus on work, but everything fell apart. My head was filled with Owen's words, his confession, his gaze. All of it came in waves that I couldn't hide from. By evening, I decided to leave my room, hoping a change of scenery would help. Downstairs in the living room, the light was on. I found Owen with a glass of wine sitting on the couch. He noticed me and looked up. There was something in his eyes that made me freeze for a moment. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, smiling restrainedly. "Yes," I replied, coming closer. "Just too many thoughts." "Maybe some company will help," he offered, gesturing to the seat next to him. I sat down, feeling the air between us fill with tension again. Owen poured me a glass of wine and, as if by accident, touched my hand. This touch was brief but left a mark, like a burning ember. "Sometimes it seems like silence speaks louder than words," he said softly, and I felt a mixture of sadness and something else in his voice. "Yes," I replied, afraid to look at him. We sat together, and I felt his closeness, his warmth. My heart was pounding, and I understood that we were on the brink of something that couldn't be stopped. I looked at him, and our gazes met. His eyes were filled with something deep, incomprehensible, as if he was struggling with himself but already knew he had lost. "Sarah," he said softly, moving closer. His voice was soft but held a desperate resolve. "You need to know that I've been trying to deny this for a long time, but I can't anymore." I didn't have time to respond. His hand rested on my cheek, his touch gentle but firm, as if he was afraid I would disappear if he let go. At that moment, everything external disappeared. There was no light, no sound in the room, only us. His face was close, so close that I could hear his breath. This moment was infinitely long and filled with silent conversation. I knew I should have stepped back, told him this was wrong, but everything I felt made me give in. When his lips gently touched mine, it was like a quiet flash of lightning. His touch was gentle, like the first gust of wind before a storm, and at the same time filled with a passion that could no longer be restrained. I felt my heart stop for a moment and then beat so fast that I was afraid he would hear it. His hand carefully slid along my neck, causing warmth to spread throughout my body. I felt his fingers rest on my hair, pulling me closer, and I allowed myself to be swept away in this moment. His kisses were both gentle and insistent, as if he wanted to show me everything he felt but was afraid to scare me away. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My entire being dissolved in this moment. We pulled away, but his forehead remained pressed against mine. Our breaths mingled, creating a sense that we were in a closed world where nothing and no one else mattered. "Sarah, I can't explain this," he whispered. "But it's too strong to ignore." I knew he was right. This feeling, this connection between us was wrong, but it also seemed inevitable, like a tide that couldn't be stopped. My consciousness told me this was a mistake, but my heart refused to listen. "Me too," I replied, my voice trembling, but with an honesty I could no longer hide. He looked at me, his eyes filled with emotions that couldn't be expressed in words. In his gaze I saw a reflection of my own feelings, passion, fear, desire, and confusion. That night became the moment when all the boundaries we had so carefully built crumbled. We both knew there was no going back. We caressed each other, taking turns following the call of our bodies. The next morning, the house was enveloped in an unusual silence. I sat on the bed, curled up, trying to gather my thoughts. But the night that had consumed me left not only a sense of closeness, but also a heaviness that was hard to comprehend. I felt guilt, fear, and the inevitability of consequences, but behind all this lay a strange sense of completion, as if something long overdue had finally happened. I went downstairs to the kitchen, where Owen was already standing by the window with a cup of coffee. His gaze was directed somewhere far away. When he heard my steps, he turned around and our eyes met. His eyes were filled with the same confusion that I felt myself. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft and slightly hoarse. "Good morning," I replied, trying to find the strength to look at him. We ate breakfast in silence, but the air was filled with tension. It wasn't unpleasant, but too thick to ignore. Every sound, the clink of a spoon, the rustle of paper, seemed louder than it should have been. "Sarah," he began, putting his cup on the table, "we need to talk." I nodded, feeling a heavy lump form in my chest. "I can't deny what I feel," he continued, looking me in the eyes. "But I understand how wrong all this is. And as much as I want to believe we can just forget, that's no longer possible." His words echoed in my head. I also understood this. We had crossed a line that not only blurred but was broken forever. But what to do now? "I don't know how to stop this," I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I tried, Owen, but I just can't." He took a deep breath and ran his hand through his hair. His face was concerned, and I could see him struggling with himself. "Sarah, I never wanted to put you in this situation," he said. "But we're both here, and we have to deal with this." The day passed in reflection. I avoided him as much as I could, but my thoughts kept returning to him. In the evening, I heard a knock at the door again. He stood in the doorway, looking tired and somewhat drained. "Sarah, may I?" His voice was barely audible. I nodded, and he came in, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking about this all day," he began, sitting in the chair opposite. "And maybe this will sound strange, but Elaine feels more than it seems. She has always been observant. I'm not sure how much she knows, but I see it in her eyes." These words made me freeze. We both understood that we were not only under close scrutiny but also on the brink of something that could destroy everything. "Do you think she knows?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm not sure. But this is another weight on our shoulders that we have to consider." When Elaine returned the next day, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. She was calm, even hospitable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she suspected something. Her gaze was too piercing, her smiles too forced. In such moments, I felt like she was reading me like an open book. One evening, when I was in the living room, Elaine came in and sat down opposite me. Her eyes studied me intently, and then she finally spoke. "Sarah, it seems to me that something is happening between you and Owen." I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled and I could barely hold the book in my hands. She continued, "I don't blame you. You're young and impressionable. But what you're doing is not only wrong but also destructive." I couldn't say a word. All I could do was listen to her voice cutting through the silence. "I'm not going to make a scene or say that everything is perfect between Owen and me," she added. "But I ask you to think about the consequences. For him, for you, for all of us." Her words left me in turmoil. She didn't shout, didn't accuse, but her calmness was more destructive than any anger. That night I met with Owen. We talked for a long time, discussing everything that had happened and trying to find a way out of this situation. We both knew we couldn't just erase these feelings, but we also couldn't continue like this. In the end, we decided that I would move out. It was the only right decision. Owen stayed in the house, and I started looking for an apartment closer to college. This decision tore me apart, but I understood it was the only way to preserve at least part of myself. When I left the house, Owen came out to see me off. His gaze was heavy, filled with emotions I would never forget. "Sarah," he said before I left, "I can't express how sorry I am that things turned out this way. But I will never forget what you mean to me." I just nodded, not trusting my voice. As I drove away, I felt like I was leaving something important behind. Perhaps something that should never have started, but now it had become a part of me forever.